Hello, my name is Stephen Thomas, and I'd like to talk about the very important and interesting question of why is it that Christians sometimes do not get healed? Now, a flippant answer might be, well, if Christians were healed all the time, they'd never die. And it is appointed to all men once to die. So we could say, in a sense, we all have to at some time succumb to something or other in order to die. But let's go into the subject in far more depth. Now, to understand this question, you have to get your mind into, first of all, the Old Covenant, Old Testament way of thinking. The Old Testament idea is that that sick folks must have sinned. This was very much an Old Covenant idea. It was founded, mistakenly, on Deuteronomy 28, a chapter full of blessings and cursings. And Old Testament people believed that if you obeyed God, you were blessed. If you disobeyed God, you were cursed. They took this to the great extreme that whenever someone appeared cursed, like sick, they must have disobeyed God. They must be cursed. So sickness equals must be cursed. And you see this attitude very clearly in the book of Job. We know, if you read the book, and I'm afraid I'm just going to go through these because I've got a lot of ground to cover, and you can get the scriptures and read the stories yourself. But the book of Job is about this righteous man, the most righteous man on earth, who gets sick, made sick by Satan, but allowed by God. So he's there sick for no reason. Job did not sin, but he was very, very, very ill, almost to the point of death. And he had 3 friends who came and told him, Job, you are sick. And what was their thinking? Because you must have sinned. And Job said, no, I insist that I'm innocent. Well, then the friend said, well, then you're saying that God is unfair because if, God can heal you of the sickness, it's very unfair that a righteous person is sick. Very unfair. This was the very Old Covenant way of thinking. And so Job, no, but I have not sinned. And he was forced to list all the good things he'd done. So his friends really got Job to talk a little bit foolishly. And in the end, God rebuked those 3 friends. He said, you're wrong. And very, very interesting point happens at the end of the book of Job, Job 42 verse 10. Before Job can get healed, he has to forgive his friends. He's told in Job 42 verse 10, pray for your friends, and then he was healed. And then a strange thing happens. Then he gets blessed double. So the whole Old Testament idea of you're righteous, you don't falter through this trial. Job was blessed twice as much at the end. Very, very Old Testament idea. And frankly, some of us Christians have taken this Old Testament idea. Well, I'm a Christian. I must be healthy and wealthy. It's just impossible for me to be otherwise. And I can tell you there's a lot of televangelists out there, a lot of preachers who have not the foggiest idea, I'm afraid to say, of what the Bible really says about Christians and health, etc. Now, taking this idea into the New Testament that if you were sick, you must have done something wrong. You were a sinner, or someone was a sinner. We can see that this idea was clearly entrenched in the disciples' mind because, bear in mind, they came out of the Old Covenant. They were being trained for the New Covenant. So if you have a look at John 9 verse 2 and 34, they come across this blind guy, and the disciples ask the question, who sinned that he was blind? Was it him or was it his parents that sinned? I mean, there was no other alternative. He was blind, therefore he's cursed, therefore someone must have sinned. Now, we in today's society, when we see an unfortunate person, we don't think, well, he must be a terrible sinner because, look, he's terribly blind. So, but they had no other alternatives. And Christ answers in John 9 verse 3, neither him nor his parents sinned. And later on you can see when this blind person tries to teach the Pharisees, they reject him out of hand. They say, you were utterly born in sin because you were blind. So they say, you were born in sin, and how dare you talk to us? So they really were entrenched in the idea that if you were blind, you must have sinned. Let's take another example, Luke 13 verse 4, where a tower in Jerusalem, the tower of, I think, Siloam, fell on some people. Now the idea there was, if that tower just fell randomly on some dudes, those dudes must have been sinners above all in Jerusalem for that tower to fall on them. It's the same thing. If you're sick, you must have sinned. And Christ, in fact, tells them, no, that's not at all the case, that the tower fell on the sinners. It just fell randomly. So you can be sick randomly. You can have a tower fall on you randomly. You needn't be cursed. You needn't be blessed. You just happen to be at the wrong place when the tower falls. Now, another example is in Mark 2, where there's a paralytic man let down through the roof of the house to Christ. And Christ says to him, your sins are forgiven you. And then the Pharisees take great offense at this, and they say, why do you say you have the power to forgive sins? You see, they had this idea, and the paralytic himself had this idea, that if he's paralytic, he must have sinned. The Pharisees felt the same thing. If he's paralytic, he's a sinner. So when Christ says your sins are forgiven you, Christ is clearing out of the paralytic's mind the idea that he's a sinner so that he can now heal him. So that's why Christ said, which is easier to say, that your sins are forgiven you, rise up and heal. And then he goes and he uses the Pharisees' own logic, and he says, okay, if paralytic means sin, then if I heal him, it proves he's no longer a sinner, and that I have the power to forgive sins. So that's the point of this story in Mark 2. Again, entrenched in the thinking that if you're sick, you must be a sinner. Now, there are many righteous folks who also were sick, Job being a very good example, for no reason of their own. Isaac, Abram, Isaac, Jacob. Isaac, remember, was so blind that he couldn't tell Esau and Jacob apart. And Isaac lived after that for many decades, because when 20-something years later, when Jacob came back, him and Esau buried Isaac. So for many decades, Isaac lived completely stone blind, or very blind. David died young. He had in his 60s, he had to be kept warm because he had some sort of problem, probably from so many stab wounds and so on. Now, if we go to the New Testament, 2 Timothy 4, verse 20, it talks about, Paul said that he left, I think his name was Trophimus, in a certain place sick. He left him there in, I think it was Miletus, sick. So, why could Paul leave a person? Why didn't Paul heal them? If so many of these televangelists and religions are correct, that if you pray, you must be healed. It's only a matter of time when you're healed. It's just your lack of faith. Well, Paul didn't lack faith. So why did Paul leave this guy helping him in the gospel sick in a certain place? He was not healed at that time. You see? It's again this false idea that every Christian must be healed. Christ never promised that. The Bible never promises that. There's not... let's give you some other examples. Philippians 2 verse 27. Let's see if Paul had the same idea that many televangelists and modern day preachers have. Paul is talking about this person who helped him in the gospel called Epaphroditus, or Epaphroditus. Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother, and companion in labor and fellow soldier, but your messenger, that he that ministered to my wants. So here's this guy that ministered to Paul's wants. For he longed after you all, and was full of heaviness because that you heard that he had been sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death. This companion of Paul, yes, this Paul, huge man of faith. I mean, what do we compare to Paul? What does anyone compare to Paul? This man of faith. And yet, the prophet Epaphroditus was sick. For indeed he was sick, nigh unto death, but God had mercy on him. You see, Paul craved the mercy. He didn't say, we demand that you heal him. We expect that you heal him. You have to heal him. You promise to heal him. No, Paul had the right balance. He was so thankful. He appreciated the miracle that God had mercy on him and healed him. He didn't expect it. He didn't demand it. He didn't say it's compulsory that God is God. He can do what he likes. He can say yes. He can say no. It just depends on what is best for his plan and for you. Might have been best for this guy and for Paul at the time for him to have been sick. And frankly, sometimes it's best that we die. Because maybe we're perfectly mature Christians, and any longer we might get less mature. Who knows? I'm not there to inform or instruct God. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have had sorrow upon sorrow. So God had mercy on this chap and on Paul. And Paul, the great Paul, couldn't just instantly heal and cure this Epaphroditus. Right. Then we come to 1 Timothy 5, verse 23, where Paul tells Timothy to have take a little wine for your stomach's sake and your oft infirmities. Timothy was often infirm or sick, and Paul didn't heal him. Timothy didn't say, oh, well, we're a Christian, we can't be sick. It's impossible. Or I'm a bad Christian. God must not be very favorably disposed. God loved Timothy. Paul loved him, but yet he was not healed. Paul himself had a thorn in the flesh that he appealed to the Lord 3 times, and the Lord said, no, my grace is sufficient for you. You're going to have to just live with this, whatever it was. Even if it wasn't a sickness, maybe it was some person who was persecuting you, you're just going to have to live with it. But that's the same thing with sickness. Sometimes God says no. Now, I'd like to go to James 5, verse 13 to 16. We see a very interesting thing. That again, people when they're sick, even Christians, think, it must be because I've sinned. And James 5, verse 13 to 16 talks about, and if he has sinned, he will be forgiven. So it's not a given that the sick person has sinned, but James has to get this idea out of the sick person's mind. Okay, if you're sick, you will be forgiven. But there's one condition that James puts upon the healing of this person. He says, and this is very interesting in James 5, verse 16, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another, that you may be healed. You pray for the other that you may be healed. Now, what must you pray? Well, I say that if you go to Job 42, verse 10, you'll know exactly what to pray. You must pray to forgive anyone that you got anything against, even your enemies. And that clears the way for the Christian's healing. So if you compare James 5, verse 16 with Job 42, verse 10, where Job had to pray for his wrong friends who had offended him by saying that he was a sinner, only then did God heal the righteous Job. Job hadn't sinned, and he was sick, and yet he had to pray for the people who had offended against him before he could be healed. The same thing with James 5, verse 16. It says, confess your faults one to another and pray one for another. That is in line with the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us our trespasses, that we may, as we forgive our trespass against others. So forgive us our trespasses. So when you come to God asking for God's grace, and you don't come demanding it, you say, God, please heal me. I know you're such a good, wonderful, fantastic, loving, kind God. Please heal me. But in the meantime, I'm getting cleared out all my hatred and animosity towards others. So there's no barrier between you healing me. Just as in the case of Job, so in the New Testament, James 5, verse 16, we have to forgive others, and that clears the way for God's grace by us extending God's grace to others. And then last of all, I would say that Job 13, verse 10 is a very important concept too, where Job said, though he slay me, I will still worship God. So Christians have to have that same approach, that even if God doesn't heal me, I'm still going to worship him, because he is still so fantastic. He knows that whatever happens to me is for my benefit and for my good, and that he will look after me, even in death. So God does heal. He promises to heal in James, but it doesn't promise to heal every person every time, not even the Christians, and not even those who believe in the health and welfare and wealth gospel. No, God is a blesser, but he doesn't have to, and he doesn't always, and he doesn't everyone all the time.